For 18 years, I lived a lie. I thought I was a devoted husband, a man who had built a life with a woman who cherished me as much as I cherished her. Our marriage was steady, our routines predictable, and our life together ordinary. Or so I believed. But secrets have a way of whispering through the cracks of even the most carefully constructed facades. It started as a feeling, an unease that settled in my gut like a stone. A stray glance at her phone screen, a dinner that ran suspiciously late, a scent that wasn't mine clinging to her skin. Little things, small enough to ignore. And I did for years. I told myself I was paranoid, that love meant trust, and that my wife, the woman I had pledged my life to, would never betray me. But she did. And when I finally uncovered the truth, I knew I couldn't simply walk away. I had spent nearly 2 decades being played for a fool. Now, it was my turn to play the game. I just had to be patient. The thing about betrayal is that it changes everything. Once you know, you start seeing the world differently. The person you loved becomes a stranger, and every memory you once cherished turns sour. I didn't confront her. Not yet. Instead, I watched. I studied her like a hunter stalking prey, memorizing her routines, her expressions, the way she tiptoed around her own guilt. She had no idea I knew, but she was nervous. I could tell. Her hands fidgeted more than usual, her laughter felt forced, and her phone never left her side. At night, she lay stiffly beside me, her back turned, as if the weight of her deception had finally become too much to bear. Good. I wanted her to feel it. The doubt, the fear, the creeping suspicion that maybe, just maybe, the walls of her carefully built deception were closing in. I was patient, and soon, she would realize that secrets don't stay buried forever. I started keeping track of everything. Dates, times, places. I noted every little inconsistency in her stories, every excuse she made, every time she left the house claiming to meet an old friend or stay late at work. 18 years. That's how long she had kept up this act. 18 years of stolen moments, whispered calls, and hidden messages. The sheer audacity of it made my blood boil, but I kept my rage contained. She thought she was careful. She thought she was untouchable. She wasn't. One night, I followed her. She left the house around 8 p.m., dressed just a little too nicely for a casual dinner with a friend. I stayed far enough behind to avoid suspicion, watching as she drove into the city and pulled into the parking lot of a quiet hotel. I didn't go inside. Not yet. Instead, I sat in my car and waited. Watching. Calculating. Letting the weight of my revenge settle into place. She came home late that night, well past midnight. I was already in bed, pretending to sleep when I heard the soft click of the front door. Her footsteps were hesitant, slow. She was trying to be quiet, trying not to wake me. I could smell his cologne on her. She slipped into bed beside me, careful not to let her body touch mine. That alone told me everything. There was a time when she would have curled into me, whispered about her long night. Now, she barely breathed. The silence between us was suffocating. The next morning, over coffee, I tested her. How was dinner? I asked casually, stirring my coffee, watching her over the rim of my cup. She hesitated, just for a second. Then, she forced a smile. Oh, it was nice. Caught up on so much. You know how Lisa is, she never stops talking. Lisa, a name pulled from thin air. A woman who probably had no idea she was being used as an alibi. I smiled back. That sounds fun. She laughed, but it was hollow, nervous. She had no idea I had been outside that hotel, watching. No idea that her carefully woven web of lies was beginning to unravel. And I would be the one to pull the final thread. She was unraveling, and I could see it. The once confident woman who had kept this secret for 18 years was starting to falter. Her hands trembled when she poured her morning coffee. She glanced at me too often, searching my face for signs that I knew something. I gave her nothing. She still believed she had the upper hand, that her betrayal was buried deep enough to never be uncovered. But doubt was eating away at her, bit by bit. One evening, as we sat on the couch, she received a text. Her phone was on silent, but I saw the screen light up from the corner of my eye. She didn't check it immediately. Instead, she shifted in her seat, deliberately casual. Then, after a moment, she reached for it, angling the screen away from me. Mistake. I leaned over just slightly, catching a glimpse of the name. E. Not Lisa. Not a friend. Just an initial. How careful. How predictable. I said nothing. Instead, I let a smirk play at my lips as I sipped my drink. She noticed. What's funny? She asked, forcing a smile. Nothing, I said. Just thinking. I watched as she swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around her phone. Good. Let the fear settle in. She had no idea what was coming. The beauty of revenge is patience. It's in the slow tightening of the noose, the gradual squeeze that makes your target suffocate under their own guilt before you ever make a move. And my wife? She was suffocating. She started second-guessing herself, checking her phone less when I was around, sneaking glances at me like she was trying to read my mind. She had a reason to be afraid. One night, I casually mentioned Lisa. How's Lisa doing? You never really talk about her. I watched her face. The way her eyes flickered, the way she forced a chuckle. Oh, you know, she said, keeping her voice light. Same old. Just busy with work. A perfect lie, spoken so smoothly. I let a pause stretch between us before nodding. Yeah, we should have her over for dinner sometime. Her fingers twitched. Barely noticeable, but I caught it. Oh, I'm not sure. She's always so busy, she said too quickly. I smiled. Well, let me know. I'd love to catch up. She barely ate that night. I had planted the seed of doubt. And now, I would watch it grow. She was losing sleep. I could hear her tossing and turning at night, sighing softly in frustration. She would get up, pace the hallway, then return to bed, careful not to wake me. Except I was already awake. The paranoia was eating at her. I made sure of it. I started leaving little hints, nothing obvious, just enough to make her wonder. A lingering glance when she picked up her phone. A casual mention of a hotel we'd never been to. A knowing smile when she thought I wasn't looking. She was unraveling beautifully. One afternoon, I walked into the kitchen just as she was ending a call. She fumbled with her phone, stuffing it into her pocket too quickly. I raised an eyebrow. Everything okay? She smiled, too big, too forced. Yeah, just Lisa again. She's thinking of moving out of state. Lisa. Again. I tilted my head. That's funny. I ran into her at the store yesterday. She didn't mention anything about moving. Her face went pale. You saw Lisa? I smiled. Yeah, had a nice little chat. I hadn't seen Lisa. I hadn't even left the house. But she didn't know that. And judging by the way her fingers tightened on the counter, I had just shattered whatever illusion of control she thought she still had. She was spiraling now, and I enjoyed every second of it. After my little lie about seeing Lisa, she became more anxious, more restless. She started checking her phone obsessively, deleting messages the moment they arrived. She thought she was covering her tracks, but all she was doing was confirming what I already knew. One night, as she stood by the sink washing dishes, I walked up behind her and placed my hands on her shoulders. She flinched. You're tense, I murmured. She forced a laugh, but it came out shaky. Just stressed with work. Work. Right. I let my fingers trail lightly down her arms before leaning in close. You know, I whispered, you've been acting different lately. She froze. Just for a second. Then she shook her head, forcing a smile. What do you mean? I shrugged, stepping back, letting the silence stretch. You just seem distracted, I said. Like something's on your mind. She turned off the faucet, drying her hands a little too slowly, trying to compose herself. No, everything's fine. Really? Liar. I smiled at her, warm and reassuring. Good, I said. Because you know you can tell me anything, right? She nodded, but her hands trembled as she folded the dish towel. She knew she was caught. She just didn't know how much I knew. Not yet. She was nearing her breaking point. I could see it in the way her hands twitched, the way she avoided my eyes, the way she hesitated before answering even the simplest questions. The weight of her secrets was crushing her. And I was adding pressure, little by little. One evening, as we sat in the living room, I pretended to be lost in thought, swirling my drink in my glass. She glanced at me nervously. You okay? I sighed. Yeah. Just thinking about something weird. She tensed. What? I turned to her, studying her face. It's funny. I had this dream the other night about you. She swallowed hard. Oh. Yeah, I said, tapping my glass. In the dream, you were meeting someone. A man. At a hotel. Her face drained of color. I smiled. Isn't that crazy? She let out a nervous laugh, but her voice wavered. Yeah. Super crazy. I leaned in slightly, my gaze never leaving hers. Dreams are strange, aren't they? Sometimes, they feel so real. Like they're trying to tell you something. She shifted uncomfortably. Well, dreams aren't real. I smirked. No, they're not. But I could see it now, that flicker of fear in her eyes. She knew. She knew that I knew. And she was terrified. She was coming apart at the seams. The dream comment had rattled her. She barely spoke at dinner that night, just pushed her food around her plate, lost in her own head. I could practically hear her thoughts racing. Does he know? How much does he know? Did I slip up? She was spiraling. Good. The next day, I decided to tighten the grip. While she was in the shower, I casually walked into the bathroom and leaned against the sink, watching her silhouette through the fogged glass. Hey, I said casually. Your phone's been blowing up. She froze mid-rinse. Oh, yeah. Some number I don't recognize. Silence. Then, far too quickly, she said, it's probably just work. Liar. I made a thoughtful sound, pretending to check the screen. Strange. No name saved. Just a number. I paused, then added, should I answer it? The way she yanked the shower door open, shampoo still in her hair, was almost too satisfying. No, she blurted, her voice an octave too high. Then she caught herself, tried to act casual. I mean, no need. I'll call them back later. I nodded, hiding my smirk. She was panicking now, and I wasn't even close to being finished. She was unraveling fast now, tripping over her own lies, watching my every move with growing paranoia. She knew something was off, she just didn't know how much danger she was in. I let her stew in it. That evening, as we sat at the dinner table, I reached across and took her hand in mine. Her fingers were ice cold, trembling slightly. You've been acting different lately, I said softly, my thumb tracing slow circles against her skin. She forced a smile. Just work stress. I tilted my head. It's more than that, isn't it? Her breath hitched. I don't know what you mean, she whispered. I squeezed her hand just enough to make her flinch. You do. A beat of silence. Then she pulled away, laughing nervously. You're being weird tonight, she said, standing quickly and grabbing our plates. I watched as she turned her back to me, her hands gripping the edge of the sink as she tried to steady herself. She was scared now. Really scared. And that was exactly what I wanted. She barely slept that night. I could feel her shifting in bed, hear her shallow breathing in the darkness. Every small noise in the house made her flinch. She was waiting for the other shoe to drop. I wasn't going to give it to her just yet. The next morning, I left for work as usual, kissing her on the forehead before I walked out the door. She stiffened under my touch. Perfect. Instead of going to the office, I parked a few blocks away and waited. Sure enough, 20 minutes later, she left in a hurry, checking over her shoulder like a fugitive. I followed. She drove across town, pulling into a small cafe, one of those tucked-away spots meant for quiet meetings. A man was already waiting for her at a corner table. Not just any man. Him. I watched as she sat down, her hands already trembling as she leaned in, speaking fast, urgent. He glanced around nervously, nodding at whatever she was saying. She was telling him that something was wrong, that she thought I might know. She was right. I snapped a few pictures from my car, the final pieces of proof I needed. And then I smiled. She thought she still had time. She didn't. When she came home that evening, she was a wreck. Her hands trembled as she set her purse down, her eyes darting toward me as if searching for some clue, some sign that I knew. I gave her nothing. Instead, I poured her a glass of wine, the same way I had for years, and smiled. Rough day. She hesitated. Yeah, just a lot on my mind. I can imagine, I said, swirling my own glass. She swallowed hard. What do you mean? I leaned back in my chair, studying her, letting the silence stretch, letting the weight of her guilt suffocate her. You know, I said finally, tilting my head. We've been together for a long time. Almost 2 decades. She nodded slowly. Yeah, of course. And in all that time, I continued, my voice smooth, calm. I don't think I've ever asked you. Do you believe in karma? Her breath hitched. I smiled. Because I do. She dropped her wine glass. It shattered against the hardwood floor, red liquid spreading like blood. I didn't flinch. She was terrified now. And she should be. Because tonight would be her last. She stood frozen, staring at the spilled wine as if it were her own lifeblood pooling at her feet. Her breathing was ragged, her hands shaking. I stayed perfectly still, watching, waiting. She finally looked up at me, her lips parted slightly, searching for words. What are you saying? I tilted my head. I think you already know. Her eyes darted toward the front door, a flicker of desperate calculation in her gaze. I smiled. Go ahead. Run. She didn't move. Good. Slowly, deliberately, I pushed back my chair and stood. The room was silent except for the soft creak of wood beneath my feet. "You see," I murmured, stepping closer, 18 years is a long time to lie to someone. A long time to betray someone who trusted you. She let out a shaky breath. "Please, I held up a finger, silencing her. "No more lies." She whimpered, stepping backward, her back hitting the counter. I'm sorry." I let out a low chuckle. "Sorry," I repeated, tasting the word. "Now you're sorry?" Her chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths. "Please, don't do this." I leaned in close, my lips just inches from her ear. "You already did this," I whispered. And then, the lights flickered. The night swallowed her scream.